Texas voters go to the polls, including to choose their nominees for a big U.S. Senate race, as Democrats see signs of surging voter enthusiasm and maybe, just maybe, a chance to turn Texas blue.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's opinion pages, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Colin Levy. It's primary day in America today. In North Carolina, Arkansas, Texas, voters go into the polls, and there will be many stories worth watching, including whether Texas Representative Dan Crenshaw will prevail over his Ted Cruz-backed primary challenger. But let's focus today on the big Texas U.S. Senate race, starting on the Republican side of the aisle. A tight battle, according to polling, between incumbent Senator John Cornyn and incumbent Attorney General Ken Paxton. Let's start with Cornyn in an interview with Fox News Digital, making the argument that he is more electable.
That's what Democrats are hoping for, the first crack in the red wall. We haven't elected a Democrat since 1994 at the statewide level. If I'm the nominee, I'll help President Trump by making sure that we carry the 5 new congressional seats as well as maintain this Senate seat, and will help him continue his agenda through the last 2 years of his term of office. If the Democrats win, because we nominate a flawed candidate with incredible baggage like the Attorney General, that last 2 years and his agenda is jeopardized, as well as everybody down ballot that we need to continue to elect as Republicans.
And here is AG Ken Paxton with an alternative point of view.
He's going to end up losing because he did not take care of his people over the last 24 years in the Senate. This idea that I can't win a race is not true, and the polling doesn't demonstrate that. There's no evidence of what he's saying is being true. As a matter of fact, the evidence is just the opposite. Look at it's. I think John spent $100 million. What a waste of money. That money should have been going to Republicans in other states, not fighting another Republican. It doesn't make any sense unless the idea here is to protect incumbency and not Republicans. This is not the way to go. Hopefully they'll stop that spending and start using it in places where we're using it against the Democrats and not fellow Republicans.
As for the president?
He makes up his own mind, as we all know.
The final polling suggesting a pretty tight race, or the Real Clear Politics average as we tape this, sitting at 37% roughly for Ken Paxton, 35% for John Cornyn. Third candidate, Congressman Wesley Hunt, somewhere in double digits down below. Kim, how do you size up the arguments on either side of this Republican primary?
Well, broadly, I think what we're seeing here, this primary season is going to be fascinating because we are seeing some really interesting divisions play out on both sides of the party. And on the Republican side, what you have in a number of races, although this Texas Senate primary is probably the most visible and most nasty of those races, are divisions between what I think by any measure are some pretty solid, stable, and conservative GOP incumbents, like what Cornyn is, versus some much more economically populist MAGA wing players whose general attitude is that any member who isn't willing to blow up norms and generally have a kind of in-your-face approach like Donald Trump is somehow establishment or rhino or choose your pejorative. And that's very much the division here between Cornyn and Ken Paxton. If you look at Cornyn's record, he has been there a very long time, but he is a very conservative member. He votes with his party almost all of the time. Probably more than many members in the Republican caucus. He was once actually a member of the leadership. But the other thing I think, which is really interesting about John Cornyn that doesn't get a lot of attention because it doesn't really rank very much in today's Washington in terms of an attribute, but that he's a very productive member. He introduces a lot of bills and he shepherds them through committee. He actually gets them into law. Not all senators do that anymore. A lot of them just stand there for the cameras. So he's somebody who actually gets things done. He's been hit in particular for one bill he did put forward, which was a gun bill that was passed into law and signed by Biden. And, look, I'm a Second Amendment absolutist, but That legislation actually did include some really important new tools in today's day and age, in which we have these young and troubled men shooting up schools. And that was that the bill allowed for background checks into juvenile detention and mental health records of purchasers who are under the age of 21. And it also stiffened penalties for straw purchases, people who buy guns for bad guys who can't buy guns. I can't really see any responsible gun owners objecting to that. There was also some money for school mental health programs and for states that are experimenting with crisis intervention procedures. In some states, those take the form of red flag laws, where courts intervene to take guns away. And those are a little bit more controversial, but I would note that this law does not incentivize those or indeed require them. And in fact, you couldn't get the money if those programs didn't have certain basic standards for process and evidentiary requirements. So this was not an over-the-top bill. He's getting hit on that. This is absolutely true that, and I was laughing when I watched that Paxton note that, they've blown $100 million to protect Cornyn. I mean, I could see primaries. I'm all for competition if the goal is actual real change. It's hard to see what Paxton would do in the Senate that Cornyn doesn't already do in terms of votes. But by challenging him, he's requiring a whole lot of money Republicans are spending in this primary that they might otherwise be using in a general election. He is a weaker candidate if he goes into this. And what would be, I think, a very safe re-election run for the Texas Senate is now one that I think would be in play if he wins primary today.
One of the arguments you hear, Colin, is that Cornyn has just been there a while. He's an old timer. It's time for a fresh face. And that gets to, I think, kind of the argument that this is about personalities maybe and focus more than really whether this is a candidate in John Cornyn who is not conservative enough for the state of Texas and the Texas electorate. Paxton made his name, I think, by trying to stir the pot, rile things up. He's bringing lawsuits all the time, often against Democratic administrations in Washington, but also against big businesses, for example, suing toothpaste manufacturers over fluoride and the packaging, the product, the amount of toothpaste on the toothbrushes on the front of their boxes. Artificial dyes. And it's sort of consonant with the Make America Healthy Again movement from RFK Jr. But Colin, I'm still one of those who considers RFK Jr. a Democrat, a pretty progressive figure who has somehow wound up in this Trump administration.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing about Ken Paxton, I think, is he's like the king of lawfare. I mean, if you think about the way he's used his office as Attorney General, I mean, it's the kind of politicized investigations and litigation that I think would put plenty of Democratic attorneys general to shame. I mean, Kim and I remember back in the day when, Eliot Spitzer was trying to boost his...
Eliot Spitzer.
Right? He was trying to boost his career as New York attorney general, by going after Wall Street with all these headline-grabbing, politicized prosecutions. I mean, that model seems, tame in comparison to what we've watched Paxton do. Since Trump has been in office, I mean, he's been, as you were saying, riding the coattails of basically every single anti-corporate, anti-business idea that comes out of the White House or that comes from RFK at HHS when they went after Tylenol and said pregnant women should avoid taking it. Paxton went after Tylenol. When RFK went after toothpaste because the fluoride was supposedly poisoning all of our children, Paxton went after the toothpaste makers. When the issue was food dyes, candies and cereal and Fruit Loops, Paxton started investigating that too. So it's all just a way to weaponize his office to, I think, attack MAGA-approved targets to the benefit, he figures, of his own political career. And so, I don't like seeing that kind of anti-business campaign in the Republican Party. I'm just not a fan of that kind of anti-business populism. And I think you could also say that he's taken a Democratic page from the Democratic playbook on the way his office uses private lawyers to go after businesses on some of these contingency fee deals. That's something we've seen in a lot of Democratic-run states. Certainly, here in Illinois, sometimes you see these attorneys general who want to do these splashy political prosecutions, and they hire outside firms, or they even deputize trial lawyers as special assistant attorneys general to sort of leverage their litigation portfolio. In Ken Paxton's case, a lot of that work went to insiders. The classic case is Tony Busby, the trial lawyer who defended him in 2023 when he had that impeachment trial on corruption charges. So there's definitely a system of cronies and friends of Ken here that are benefiting from this anti-business push.
On the point about anti-business, just to underline that, here's a piece of Ken Paxton in a press release when he sued the maker of Advil. Quote, "Big Pharma betrayed America by profiting off pain and pushing pills regardless of the risks." He went on to say, "By holding Big Pharma accountable for poisoning our people, we will help make America healthy again." And remember, this is a lawsuit against the maker of Advil. This is not some kind of opioid settlement or something like that Ken Paxton is talking about here. Kim, I guess maybe there are some elements in the Republican primary base where rhetoric like that is popular, anti-business, certainly anti-big business. I guess, to my mind, it would probably not be popular with other elements of Republican primary voters, and maybe a liability in the general election, adding to Ken Paxton's other liabilities, including his impeachment and then acquittal by the Texas Senate, his kind of ugly divorce, his wife saying she was filing for divorce on biblical grounds. So to the point that you were making earlier, Kim, part of the difficulty here is that it looks to me, just surveying the polling and just as a fundamental political matter, that John Cornyn, as an incumbent, is probably a safer bet for Republicans. But the question of electability is always a two-part question, I guess. Which of these candidates are more electable? And then do the primary voters actually take that into account? Or are there a lot of primary voters who want someone who is more reflective of the way that they are feeling in this moment? And they want someone who fights, even if getting that candidate as the nominee across the finish line in November is less of a sure thing.
Yeah, well, that's what Paxton is banking on. And I really want to throw that out there. There's an element of a cynicism in here that if things ultimately do go wrong in Texas, I hope that it is laid at Ken Paxton's feet. Because, on the one hand, if he is to win this primary, and let me note here, it's unlikely that we're going to get a final result in this particular race today. You have to get across the 50% mark. There are 3 candidates running in this primary. The polling, unless it's way off, suggests that things are pretty evenly divided between Paxton and Cornyn, with Wesley Hunt, the third candidate, getting a smaller amount, but enough to ensure that nobody hits 50%. But if Paxton were to ultimately prevail in this, he goes in and he does have many, many liabilities. And just to resurrect a couple that you mentioned here, we kind of glossed over it, but he was in 2023 impeached by the Texas House of Representatives, which had accused him of abusing his office to benefit a political donor and using staff to cover up an extramarital affair. And let me remind everybody, this was the Republican House in Texas that impeached him. And he ultimately got off because, as with at the federal level, you have to also be convicted by the Texas Senate. The bar is quite high, and they were not actually able to pull that off. But then you also have, he was indicted back in 2015 on felony security fraud charges. Those were later dropped as part of a deal that required him to do some community service. There have been FBI investigation, whistleblower lawsuits, and obviously this very messy divorce proceeding in which his wife has been very clear that she is accusing him of adultery. And, private lives are private lives, but that is out there now in this race, and it will matter with at least some elements of the electorate. So if he gets in ultimately as the nominee, he goes in with a huge number of liabilities and puts this state into play. On the other hand, if Cornyn comes out of this, he's also done huge damage to Cornyn with all of these accusations and claims, et cetera, which is likely to demoralize some of the Republican electorate who will be less likely to be excited and go out and vote for Cornyn in a general election. And if the Democrats end up with a very charismatic candidate on that side, Texas has been close at least once in history. The Republicans have had a strong lock on it. Ted Cruz won quite comfortably in his last reelection bid, but it's not a sure thing. And if you've got a blue wave coming, we don't know, but historically there are indications that this could be a very good year for Democrats. This is the moment you should be worried, and Paxton is making sure that's more of a worry.
Wesley Hunt, let's say a few words about him. He's an impressive guy, West Point graduate, helicopter pilot, congressman now for a couple terms. But he seems to be playing the role of third wheel here. And part of what makes these kinds of primaries hard to predict is if you go to a runoff, I'm not sure which way his voters pull. On the one hand, if they're Hunt supporters now, they seem to have to like the idea of a fresh face in Washington, somebody a little bit younger and more energetic than maybe John Cornyn. And yet, if they are Hunt voters now, maybe there's a reason that they have not been pulled over into Ken Paxton's camp already. Let's turn now to the Democratic side of the aisle. Fascinating arguments, similar in some ways. It seems like it's a fight over personality more than politics. You have Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett facing off with State Representative James Talarico. One notable endorsement in recent days, former Vice President Kamala Harris coming out in the Crockett camp. Listen to this robocall.
Hi, this is Kamala Harris, and I'm calling to encourage you to please go vote for my friend Jasmine Crockett in the Democratic primary today, Friday, February 27th, or on Election Day, Tuesday, March 3rd. Texas has the chance to send a fighter like Jasmine Crockett to the United States Senate. Jasmine has the experience and record to hold Donald Trump and his billionaire cronies accountable. But Jasmine can only do it if people like you vote early. Today, Friday, February 27th, or on Election Day, Tuesday, March 3rd. It's time to turn Texas blue, and I thank you. Please take care. Bye-bye.
Paid for by Jasmine for Texas.
Colin, similar sort of framing there. Not this is the candidate who is going to push for the specific policies we want. It's we need a fighter who will stand up to Donald Trump very loudly and his billionaire cronies.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I would definitely say that Jasmine Crockett is pitching herself as a fighter, and she's doing that very much the same way that Ken Paxton is on the right, really trying to say to the base that, you know, I'm the person you want in a cage match. I'm the one who's going to, you know, sort of go to the mat for you. You know, I'm not going to do this just the same way that it's been done over the past 2 decades, and we're the new face of the party. But obviously, the person that's the strongest fighter, you know, or the fiercest, nastiest fighter, maybe is a better way to say it, isn't necessarily the same person who's going to really thrive in the somewhat more staid environment of the Senate or serve voters best. I mean, certainly to the point we were talking about earlier, you know, on the right, what really serves Trump best to the questions of MAGA voters is to have a Republican majority in Congress, right? So if Paxton is that much more vulnerable as he is in these head-to-head matchups with both Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico, it would go better the other way. So, you know, by the way, both of these candidates on the Democratic side are liberal candidates. They've said that they would get rid of the filibuster, and so, you know, it would be easier to pass bold legislation, and that's definitely not a moderate position.
On that point, Kim, I'm looking at a Q&A with both of these candidates by the Texas Tribune, and James Talarico says not only that he wants to get rid of the filibuster, but he wants to pass term limits for Supreme Court justices. He is trying to hedge a little bit on Medicare for All. He's talking about how healthcare is a human right, and he has a plan called Medicare for Y'all, Y''ALL. And so it's basically a kind of buy-in, I guess, program where anybody could enter Medicare if they choose to do so. But to my mind, that looks like it is more a branding exercise than a policy difference. And so he is a quite progressive candidate, Kim, but he also has, to this point about personality and being a cage fighter, he also has the persona of a Presbyterian seminarian, which is what he is. And so that is part of the distinction here, is this fight over not which way the policy winds in the Democratic Party are blowing, but which of these people most fits how voters feel at the moment.
Yeah, I have a slightly maybe different take on what you've been talking about in terms of personality. This race is another example of a a split we're seeing in the party that goes along these lines, which is that Democrats have been extremely concerned, and they should be, about the problems they're having in the polls with blue-collar working class voters, which Republicans have made huge inroads in. And Bernie Sanders in particular has been trying to crack the code on this. How do you rekindle interest and an affinity with those kind of voters with a progressive agenda? And they understand that part of their problem is a big cultural problem. So if you look at those two candidates, Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico, they are both super progressive. Let's just be clear about that. It is Medicare for all, even if it has a Y in its name. He wants, there's climate fanaticism there. They want to kill the filibuster. They want to, stack the Supreme Court. They are entirely in line with the progressive left. What you see in Talarico is a little bit like what you have seen in this candidate that Sanders has recruited up in Maine, Graham Plattner, who, when he opens his mouth, he sounds just like Bernie Sanders, but he also just happens to be a veteran, a blue-collar worker, an oysterman. If you watch his launch video, it's hilarious. The guy's out there with kettlebells and diving, and he's driving his boat. It kind of looks like a tryout video for stunt double for Jason Momoa and Aquaman. And the goal here is to, have an affinity with these blue-collar voters and say, I'm one of you. And that's what they're betting with Talarico in Texas, which is that because he's a Presbyterian seminarian and he speaks openly about his religion. Now, he does it for very progressive aims, but he is happy to talk about it. And the bet is that if he comes through and he wins this primary, that's going to make him a lot more palatable to Texas independents, or maybe moderate Republicans or moderate Democrats who are a little anxious about progressive ideology, and who might be unhappy right now with Donald Trump's agenda, but they could also struggle to vote for a Democrat who comes out and seems actively hostile to their faith or their way of life. And that's why you see, it's interesting. You have some folks like Kamala Harris helping out Jasmine Crockett, but a lot of the money men and a lot of the smart guys in the Democratic operation are working for and would like to see Talarico win this. They consider him a much stronger candidate to go up, in particular against a Ken Paxton. I mean, also think about that contrast there. Talarico, Presbyterian seminarian, versus Ken Paxton, who has just been abandoned by his wife on biblical grounds. They would love to see that contrast. So it'll be interesting to see who prevails in this, because I still think Crockett has the sort of running room, because there's a lot of progressive voters in this primary that will be more enthused by her style and manner of take it to them fighting.
Final check-in on the polls. The Real Clear Politics average has Talarico at 52% and Crockett at 42%. But the surveys have been all over the place, including one recently that had Crockett up by 18 points. So a little bit hard to tell. Colin, meanwhile, we've had this real surge of enthusiasm. Here's the top of an Austin American-Statesman story. More than 1.5 million Democrats voted early in the 2026 primaries. 500,000 more than cast ballots during the entirety of the party's midterm primaries 4 years ago. So that is some real record turnout, at least for early voting. Always, you have to wait until the final numbers are in, because voters can shift between day of voting and early voting. And we also don't know what this very enthusiastic primary portends for November. But Colin, we'll give you the last word. Democrats feeling a little bit optimistic about those numbers, at least as we sit here today on Tuesday.
No question about that. They're all looking forward to some sort of blue wave coming. I think one really important point here to finish maybe is that if Paxton becomes the Republican nominee, we know the general election is going to be very, very close. And that matters on a national level, obviously, because Republicans don't want to lose that seat. And so it will force Republicans to spend money in Texas that they might otherwise spend elsewhere as they're fighting to hold on to their, narrow lead in Congress.
Thank you, Colin and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.